Yesterday afternoon, a 29-year-old Uzbek national drove a rented truck into a crowded bike path, killing 8 people and injuring more than a dozen others. And by daybreak, the President of the United States was taking to Twitter to blame Senate Minority Leader from New York, Chuck Schumer, writing, "The terrorists came into our country through what is called the Diversity Visa Lottery Program, a Chuck Schumer beauty. The program Trump was referring to gives visas to countries from which there are low rates of immigration to the U.S. And while Schumer did help bring about the program in 1990, George H.W. Bush signed it into law, by the way, he was also part of a bipartisan group known as the Gang of Eight that tried to get rid of it in 2013. And Schumer shot back both on the floor of the Senate this morning and at a press conference after.
The president ought to stop tweeting and start leading. The American people long for leadership. All President Trump does is take advantage, horrible advantage, of a tragedy and try to politicize and divide.
But never one to back down, Trump doubled down on his calls for action during a White House cabinet meeting.
We're so politically correct that we're afraid to do anything. We're being stopped by Democrats because they're obstructionists. And honestly, they don't want to do what's right for our country. We need strength. We need resolve. We have to stop it. So we're going to get rid of this lottery program as soon as possible.
But even if he does, would attacks like yesterday's be prevented? Joining me to discuss are Carol Savietz. She's a senior advisor at MIT's Security Studies program. Good to see you again,
nice
Carol.
To see you, Jim.
Boston College political scientist and terrorism expert, Peter Krause. Good to see you too, Peter. You know, starting with you, George Bush the younger, I just mentioned the elder, his mantra used to be, defeat them there so that they don't come here.
Right.
Now it seems if we defeat them there, like in Raqqa, that guarantees they will come here. I mean, this is what's going to happen, yes?
Well, it certainly sounds like it, and Peter is our terrorism expert, but I don't think it's clear that this guy was a radical when he came into the country. I mean, all the reading that I've been doing, yeah, he was radicalized here, self-radicalized. Uzbekistan is not necessarily a radical place, although increasingly people from Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan have been fighting with ISIS in the Middle East.
But even if he wasn't radicalized when he came here in 2010, what the police in New York City are saying is he followed to the T, to the letter, ISIS instructions in carrying out this attack yesterday. So if it didn't happen then, it happened once he got here.
Yeah, but following to the T means like they put out online what type of truck is the right one to get. At the end of the day, these are very difficult attacks to stop. I think that's one of the reasons that the focus has been on the immigrant program or things like this, because in terms of stopping a car or a truck from going into a crowd, it's a very difficult thing to do.
I mean, ISIS hasn't claimed credit. You and I were discussing this before we went on the air. What does that mean? Because the cops in New York are saying this is an ISIS-inspired effort.
Sure. So it seems that both in terms of the notes that he wrote as well as his discussions with the police that he's saying this was inspired by ISIS. But ISIS rarely claims attacks when someone's in custody but still alive.
And so they haven't claimed it.
They have not claimed yet. Right. Now, what also matters in this sense is it's not just the claiming of it, it's the fact that he was following to a T. Here's the type of truck you want to do. It's kind of like the Boston Marathon bombing where it seems like the information's online and people are doing it based on that.
I want to follow up on something Peter said a minute ago. I have no expertise in this area, and he does. However, common sense suggests that when you do a low-tech thing like this and do a decent amount of planning, whether it's Nice or here with a truck, it is almost unpreventable. I mean, is that not a fair statement?
Well, I think you're right. What they were talking about yesterday, certainly as this unfolded, was that there's nothing separating the roadway from the bike path on the West Side Highway. That if there had been some kind of cement stanchions or whatever between the two, that the truck would have had a lot more trouble hitting the people. The same with the Promenade des Anglais in Nice. There's nothing separating it, the road from, and people were out on the street.
So that's a fair statement, is these things are unpreventable like this. I don't mean to minimize, obviously, any part of this, but that is the truth.
I think there's two things you can do. One is the barriers, whether permanent ones in major thoroughfares or temporary ones when there's a big crowd temporarily. Like
they do in Boston now, by the way.
Absolutely. Yeah. The second thing is, honestly, the same type of stuff you should do. Don't walk across the street looking at your phone or things like that. You're honestly more likely to get hit by a car, not a terrorist attack, but nonetheless, those are the types of things you can do.
You know, it's so hard to say is anything positive, but so I maybe shouldn't use that word. I wasn't shocked that this happened. I'm shocked that it's been 16 years. This is the largest terror attack in terms of its toll in New York City since September 11th. That, to me, suggests, and I hope you agree, that we're doing something right? It's not just luck, is it? Or is it?
I think you're absolutely right. And if you looked at polls of Americans at the time, the vast majority of the American public would have agreed with you.
Sure, that
another attack was going to come.
Right.
I think that the reason that this happens now is in part, in the past 2 years, we've seen this rise in vehicular terrorism because it is so easy to do. It's pretty lethal, much harder to build a bomb or do things of this nature. So I think NYPD, FBI, et cetera, have done a great job in New York in general, but things like this are more difficult to defend against.
You know, before we get to Donald Trump's, I think, at least from my reading, three-part plan for dealing with this. I'm not an historian, but I can't think of another president of the United States when there's been a terror attack, either more conventional terror whose immediate reaction was to attack a leader of the other part. Has there ever been a moment like this that you can, either of you can think of?
No, I can't think of any other. And I think even Chuck Schumer in his statement today said we need a leader, where even George W. Bush said X, Y, and Z. And why aren't you, Donald Trump, saying that? I think
by the
it's
way, there
very
are
clear.
few people who, even those who can't stand the policies of George W. Bush, who didn't feel when he stood on that pile of rubble with an arm around a firefighter a day or two after, that was not what a leader is supposed to be.
Exactly.
In the best.
Exactly.
So let's talk about his prescriptions. One, you can pick anyone you want. Extreme vetting, I have no idea what that means, and obviously it wouldn't help here.
I don't think he does, and why would he pick Uzbekistan as opposed to the countries on his list?
Well, then that's your answer. We'll get yours in a couple of seconds. 2, blaming Schumer for this diversity lottery program. He wants to get rid of that. Would that be helpful? And thirdly, he said, well, actually, let's hear what he says about the slowness of the justice system in cases like this. Here's the president today.
We also have to come up with punishment that's far quicker and far greater than the punishment these animals are getting right now. We need quick justice, and we need strong justice, much quicker and much stronger than we have right now. Because what we have right now is a joke. Send him to Gitmo. I would certainly consider that, yes.
So, I mean, it's hard to argue against quicker justice, but is the justice we currently have not quick?
I think the challenge here is, number one, it's not just the attacker himself. I think it's pretty clear with his admissions and otherwise that this guy is likely guilty of this attack. The challenge is, what do you think about the broader population? From President Trump's perspective, it's not so much that this guy's the problem. He doesn't, in general, I think, like immigration from these countries. It's kind of the reverse in some sense of the Vegas attack.
Uzbekistan was not on his list.
Absolutely.
That's what I was saying.
But it's a Muslim-majority country, so he's going to be somewhat skeptical of immigration from there anyway, to be honest. But the Vegas attack is kind of the opposite, where people are coming out saying we need to have more restrictions on guns or whatnot. A lot of that is not so much about the attack itself. It's about how do you feel in general about this issue of gun safety versus immigration, and that's driving a lot of the politics.
What is extreme vetting?
I think it's more questions about your personal background, looking at your social media accounts, things of this nature. But to be honest,
which John Kelly says we're now doing.
You already kind of do a lot of this stuff.
Security.
So it's the type of thing of saying, I need to do something, be more restrictive. But when you get down to brass tacks and what can be done,
but wait a
it's
minute.
not much more than what we've done
But we don't
already.
know when this particular gentleman was radicalized, whatever even that means. And if they had looked at his social media accounts in 2010, it could have showed nothing.
Added to that, this is a key thing, there was a program in place to tell literally Home Depot and U-Haul places to be on the lookout, have their antenna up for people who might be suspicious. That to me seems very problematic. I mean, to put the guy behind the desk making minimum wage a little bit above, to profile people, whether they can rent a truck, more problems than solutions.
How about dumping this diversity lottery visa program that he's talking about, which is the program under which apparently this killer came in under? Is there any value to that? I mean, obviously, if it didn't exist, he might not have gotten in 7 years ago. But is there value to that or no?
I don't know. I mean, if it doesn't dovetail with the other restrictions that he's put on immigration, I don't know what it means or doesn't mean. I mean, again, how do we know who's a radical? If somebody is radicalized here, I don't see what it does.
So it's more red meat as far as you're concerned, yes?
I think it's important to look at the data, right? No one who disagrees looked at the facts. This is a very small number of people who have ever come to this program and committed any violent act. So really the judgment comes down to how do you feel about those tens of thousands of others who have come in on it? If you like that for the diversity of America, you want to keep the program. If you don't, this is an excuse to get rid of it.
He's leaving for a long trip to Asia. Some of the countries that he's visiting are going to come close to have had problems with radicals who hide behind Islam as well.
One of the biggest
put
vehicular
him in a better spot? Oh, go on, I'm sorry.
Well, sorry, real quick. One of the biggest vehicular attacks was in Western China in one of their arrested provinces.
That's exactly right.
So it's very possible he could use that as a common ground to talk with the Chinese.
So will that, I mean, in some ways, will that give him an advantage? I mean, I assume a disadvantage is, I don't even know if this is true, is the fact that a couple of people involved with him, 3 people have been indicted, 1 has pled guilty. That's not a wonderful way to start a trip. But will the attacks put him in a better spot?
It's certainly going to create, I think, a line of sympathy with the Chinese, who are, as Peter said, dealing with the Uyghur population and problems there. And Central Asia in general has been in ferment, and it touches the Chinese border in any number of countries. And I think that that is an issue and something that Trump could play on.
Well, also, isn't this, even if you don't like the content of the rhetoric, isn't this kind of tough rhetoric the kind of thing that a lot of leaders around the world not only like to hear, but like to practice, no?
Sure. You get the rally around the flag effect to some extent. It's not nearly as extreme as, say, like the coup in Turkey against Erdogan, but leaders will oftentimes use these types of attacks to push along agendas they either had previously or new ones on counterterrorism or whatnot that he wants to do with Asian countries.
We only have 30 seconds. Can we end where we began? Just if somebody is intent and has a brain and decides to rent a truck in 2017 to attempt to kill people, the likelihood is fairly good, sadly, that he or she is going to be able to get away with it.
And the reporting is that this man had a trucker's license, so that he never would have even been questioned at the Home Depot.
Is that true?
The answer is not just barriers and whatnot. It's also these broader, more difficult things in terms of war of ideas or not dehumanizing people, because that makes it less likely someone wants to do this in the first place.
Carol, nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
Peter, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Jim. Great
Appreciate
talking with you.
Thank you both.